The folder landed on the desk in front of me like a verdict. Not slid. Not placed. Landed. My boss. The new VP of Operations, a man who'd been in the building for 11 weeks, didn't even look up when he did it. "We're restructuring your division," he said. "Your role's been eliminated." I looked at the folder. Then I looked at him. He was 34 years old, had an MBA from Queens, and had never once set foot on a job site in his life. I knew this because 3 weeks into his tenure, he'd asked me what a load-bearing assessment was. I'm not exaggerating. He genuinely didn't know. I'd been with Redpath Infrastructure Solutions for 16 years. 16 years of 6 a.m. starts. 16 years of driving out to sites in Sudbury and Thunder Bay and places you don't find on a tourist map. 16 years of building the company's field operations from a regional crew of 9 people into a national division of over 200. I'd been the one who pushed to expand into Alberta when everyone else thought it was too much risk. I was right. That expansion now accounts for roughly 40% of the company's annual revenue. And on a Tuesday afternoon in February, in a glass-walled boardroom in downtown Toronto, a man I barely knew handed me a folder and told me my role had been eliminated. "We appreciate everything you've contributed," he said. He actually said that, word for word. I picked up the folder. I didn't open it. I stood up, extended my hand, and said, "Thank you." He blinked. I think he expected me to argue, or cry, or at least ask why. But I'd been in this industry long enough to know that when a VP of operations, who doesn't know what a load-bearing assessment is, tells you your role has been eliminated, the decision wasn't made in that room. It was made somewhere above his pay grade, and nothing you say in the next 5 minutes is going to change it. So I said thank you, shook his hand, and walked out. What he didn't know, what nobody in that building seemed to have thought about, was that I'd spent the last 3 years quietly building something on the side. Not because I saw this coming. I want to be honest about that. I didn't see it coming. I built it because I believed in it, and because after 16 years I knew things about infrastructure project management that no software on the market had ever properly accounted for. I'd actually pitched the concept internally twice. Both times it went nowhere. The first time, my old boss said the timing wasn't right. The second time, the new VP told me it sounded interesting, and then I never heard another word about it. So I kept building it on my own time. Evenings, weekends. My wife, she'll kill me for saying this, basically became a widow from February to October of the year I finally got the prototype working. She'd come into the home office at 11 at night and set a cup of tea on the desk without saying anything, because she knew if she asked how much longer I'd be, she'd get an honest answer, and she didn't want one. The system I built was a field operations platform, specifically designed for mid to large infrastructure contractors operating across multiple provinces. It solved a problem that every operations manager in this industry has, but nobody talks about publicly. The gap between what a project looks like on paper in the head office and what it actually looks like on the ground in week 7 when weather's delayed the pour and 2 of your sub-trades are in a dispute. I called it ground line. I had not sold it to anyone yet. I had not licensed it to anyone. I had not, critically, signed any agreement with Redpath that gave them any claim to intellectual property developed outside of work hours, on personal equipment unrelated to my direct job function. I knew this because I'd had a lawyer review my employment contract 18 months before I was fired. Not because I expected to be fired. Because I was building something valuable, and I wanted to be certain it was mine. It was mine. The morning after I was let go, I drove my daughter to school. She was 10 at the time, and she didn't fully understand what had happened. Only the dad wasn't going to work today. She asked me if I was sad. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She said, "Well, you don't have to wear a tie today, so that's one good thing." She's 10. She has a point. My wife made eggs. We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me, and she says this about everything. It's her whole philosophy. She said, "Everything works out the way it's supposed to." I've heard her say that through 2 miscarriages, a car accident that rode off our first house's garage, and her mother's diagnosis. She says it every time. And every time I initially want to argue with her about it, and every time she ends up being right. I drank my coffee and thought about the folder I'd never opened, still sitting in my bag. My severance was decent. 16 years gets you something in Ontario, especially at a director level. I had runway. Not forever, but enough. Enough to not make a panic decision. The first call I made, not that day, I gave myself a week, was to a man I'd worked with briefly on a federal infrastructure project about 6 years back. He'd since become the head of project delivery at one of Redpath's main competitors, a firm called Castellan Group out of Calgary. We weren't close, but we'd stayed in occasional contact and he respected my work. I knew this because he'd told me, unsolicited, at an industry dinner 2 years ago. He'd said, "If you ever leave Redpath, call me." I'd laughed it off at the time. I wasn't leaving Redpath. Well, I called him. His name is not important to this story, but I'll tell you, he answered on the second ring, and when I explained the situation, there was a pause, and then he said, "How soon can you be in Calgary?" I told him I wasn't looking for a job. Another pause, then what are you looking for? I told him about Groundline. The call lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because my phone died at the end of it and I had to find the charger before I could tell my wife how it went. When I walked into the kitchen and plugged in my phone, she looked at my face and said, "Good call?" I said, "Yeah, good call." What followed was 3 weeks of due diligence that I was not prepared for emotionally, even though I was prepared for it logistically. When you've been inside a large company for 16 years, you forget what it feels like to have someone scrutinize your work with genuine commercial interest rather than corporate politics. The Castellan team sent a technical lead to review the platform architecture. They had their legal team go through my IP documentation. They asked questions that were hard and specific and showed they actually understood what they were looking at. It was, honestly, more intellectually stimulating than anything I'd done in the last 4 years at Redpath. The thing I want you to understand about what Groundline actually solved, because this matters to how the story ends, is that it wasn't just a project management tool. That's how I described it internally when I pitched it twice and got nowhere. That description is accurate, but it undersells what makes it different. The platform integrates field-level data in real time and uses it to model downstream schedule risk. That sounds like jargon. Here's what it means practically. If your concrete crew in Lethbridge reports on Thursday morning that the ground conditions are worse than spec, my system flags by Thursday afternoon what that means for the electrical rough-in that was supposed to start in week 9, what it means for your labor commitments in weeks 10 through 12, and what alternative sequencing options are available given your current sub-trade contracts. It doesn't just tell you there's a problem, it tells you how big the problem actually is, and what your options are, before your site super has even finished writing the daily report. I built it because I'd spent 16 years watching project managers make decisions based on information that was already 2 weeks old by the time it reached them. I knew exactly what the industry needed because I'd lived inside the gap. Redpath had passed on it twice. Castellan Group did not pass on it. 26 days after I walked out of that boardroom in Toronto and said thank you, I signed a licensing agreement with Castellan Group for Groundline. The terms included an upfront payment, a royalty structure tied to active users, and a consulting arrangement that had me working with their delivery team for the first 18 months of implementation. I'm not going to state the exact figures publicly. My accountant would prefer I didn't, but I'll tell you it was enough that my wife cried when I showed her the number. She's not a crier. She told me later she cried because she thought about all the nights I'd stayed up, and she brought me tea, and she'd never once asked me to stop. I don't deserve her. I know this. The week after the agreement was signed, I got a call from a former colleague still at Redpath. We'd worked together for years, and she kept me in the loop on things occasionally, the way people do when they're still inside a company and they feel some loyalty to someone who left. She told me, carefully, that the new VP had announced at a division meeting that Redpath was going to develop an in-house operations platform. She said he'd described it in terms that sounded very familiar. She said a few people in the room had exchanged looks. I thanked her for letting me know. I told her I didn't think there was anything to worry about. I also forwarded the information to my lawyer, who confirmed that the consulting agreement and IP documentation I'd established prior to my departure was clear enough that there was no realistic exposure. What Redpath was proposing to build, they'd have to build from scratch. And building something like Groundline from scratch without someone who'd spent 3 years learning what the problems actually were. Well, I'd seen how Redpath handled complexity under new leadership. I wished them luck, sincerely. The part of the story I think about most, when I think about it now, is not the agreement, and it's not the money, and it's not even the specific satisfaction of watching the company that let me go try to build the thing they'd twice told me wasn't a priority. The part I think about is my team. When I ran field operations at Redpath, I had a core group of people, project leads, regional coordinators, a few analysts who were genuinely excellent at their jobs. They were the kind of people who made every project better than it would have been without them. After I was gone, 3 of them reached out to me in the first month, not to ask for anything, just to check in. One of them sent me a message that said, "The division doesn't feel the same. Whatever you end up doing next, I hope you land well." When the Castellan agreement included a consulting arrangement, I had some flexibility in how I structured the advisory team supporting implementation. Within the first year, 2 of my former Redpath colleagues had joined that team on contract. A third followed 6 months later. I didn't recruit them in any improper way. They came to me, and the timing worked out. But I want to be honest, I looked for ways to make it possible, because those people had given 16 years of loyalty to a company through me, in part. And they deserved to land somewhere that valued what they actually brought. My daughter asked me, about a year after all of this, why I hadn't been more angry when I was fired. She's curious about everything. She'd heard bits of the story over time, the way kids absorb things without you meaning to tell them. She asked why I'd said thank you instead of arguing. I thought about it before I answered her. I told her that being angry in that moment would have felt good for about 20 minutes and accomplished nothing, and that the better move was to walk out the door with my reputation intact, not say anything I'd regret, and let the outcome do the talking. She thought about that for a second. Then she said, "So you were like a chess player?" I laughed. I said, "Sure, something like that." She said, "Chess is boring, though." She's not wrong. But the ending here wasn't boring. Here's what I've come to understand on the other side of all of it. I spent 16 years being genuinely committed to an organization. I gave it my best thinking, my longest hours, my best ideas, including 2 ideas I handed over for free that went nowhere internally. And when a new person came in with a different vision and a preference for people who looked good in presentation decks, rather than people who knew what a load-bearing assessment was, I became a liability to their optics, rather than an asset to the actual business. That's not a unique story. I know that. The comment sections on these videos always fill up with people who've lived a version of it. The details change. The industry, the numbers, the specific flavor of the person who let you go. But the core of it is the same. You build something. Someone else decides you don't fit the new picture. And then you have to figure out what you do with 16 years of knowledge that the organization just handed back to you. What I did was build something, and I built it before I needed it, which is the only reason it was there when I did. If you take nothing else from this, and I realize I'm not a life coach, I'm just a guy who used to manage infrastructure projects and now does it in a different structure. Take that. Don't wait until the folder lands on the desk. Build the thing you've been thinking about building. Document what you know. Understand what you own. Talk to a lawyer if you have agreements you've never read carefully. Because the person sitting across from you when that folder lands might be 34 years old and have no idea what a load-bearing assessment is. And on that day, everything you've built on your own time, in your own right, on your own equipment, that's the only thing that's actually yours to walk out with. I said thank you. And then I walked out. The rest took care of itself.